In the history of how the world is won and lost, we are taught to look for the clash of steel and the roar of cannons. We are told that the fate of civilizations is decided on the battlefield, by the courage of generals and the movements of vast armies. But this is the version of history written for children. It is a version that ignores the quiet, invisible power that truly dictates the rise and fall of nations. If you want to understand how the map of the modern world was actually drawn, you have to look past the smoke of the battlefield and into the silent ink of the ledger book. You have to understand that the most devastating weapon ever invented was not the machine gun or the nuclear warhead. It was the concept of compound interest. This is the story of history's most surprising wealth hack. It is a story of how the world's most powerful empires, titans that controlled the oceans and ruled over millions, were not defeated by a superior enemy, but were foreclosed upon by their own accountants. To understand how this hack works, we have to look at the world at the peak of a power's glory. We see an empire that looks, to any outside observer, completely invincible. It is a splash of color on a map that covers a quarter of the globe, a dominion where the sun never sets, protected by a navy that has not been challenged for a century. From the marble halls of its capital to the remote outposts of its colonies, the architecture of power is everywhere. But beneath this veneer of imperial majesty, the foundation is often already turning to dust. While the parades are marching in the streets, the national treasury is being drained to pay for the very glory the public is cheering for. The empire is not growing. It is overextending. It is a giant with armor of steel but feet of clay, surviving not on its own productivity, but on the high-interest loans of foreign banks. We are told that wealth is gold, or land, or oil, but history teaches us a much darker and more surprising truth. Wealth is often nothing more than a temporary illusion created by debt. And once you allow someone else to hold your mortgage, you no longer own your flag, your borders, or your future. In this first chapter, we go back to the moment the hack was first deployed, the moment a superpower realized it could buy the appearance of modernity with other people's money, only to realize too late that every bond is a chain. To see this wealth hack in its most lethal form, we must look at the year 1875. The setting isn't a muddy trench, but a lavish dining room in London. The man at the center of the story is Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, and the object of his obsession is a strip of water in the Egyptian desert, the Suez Canal. At this moment, the British Empire was the undisputed master of the world. Its navy owned the oceans, and its industry fueled the globe. But Britain had a problem. The Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the empire, was controlled by the French and the Khedive of Egypt. For Britain, the canal was the only way to reach India, the crown jewel, without sailing for months around the tip of Africa. If that waterway was ever closed, the empire would suffocate. Then the hack presented itself. The Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, was a man who loved the appearance of power. He had spent millions trying to turn Cairo into the Paris of the Nile. He built opera houses, palaces, and vast public works, all funded by high-interest loans from European banks. By 1875, the bill had come due. Egypt was not just broke, it was drowning. The Khedive was desperate. He had one asset left to sell, his 44% stake in the Suez Canal. He sent a secret telegram to London, offering the shares for £4 million. In today's money, it was a pittance for the most strategic piece of infrastructure on Earth. But there was a catch. He needed the money in 48 hours, or he would sell to the French. Disraeli knew that the British Parliament would take weeks to vote on the funds. In the world of high-stakes geopolitics, bureaucracy is the enemy of opportunity. So he turned to the only power faster than a government: the banks, specifically the House of Rothschild. Over a casual dinner, Disraeli's secretary asked Lionel de Rothschild for the £4 million. Rothschild didn't ask for collateral. He didn't ask for a treaty. He simply ate a grape, looked at the secretary, and asked, "What is your security?" The answer was, "The British government." "You shall have it," Rothschild replied. With a single check, written in a private room, Britain bypassed the slow gears of democracy and the sovereignty of Egypt. They didn't fire a single shot. They didn't march an army into Cairo. They simply bought the mortgage to the world's most important shortcut. But the hack has a second act. Once Britain owned the canal's debt, they owned Egypt's future. Within years, when Egypt couldn't pay the interest on its remaining loans, the British didn't send bankers, they sent the Royal Navy. They occupied the country to protect their investment. This is the cold mathematics of the wealth hack. You use debt to buy the assets of your rivals when they are at their weakest. You don't conquer them, you liquidate them. Egypt thought it was borrowing money to become a modern power. Instead, it was signing the deed of its own colonization. If the story of the Suez Canal is about using debt to seize a shortcut, the story of the Spanish Empire is a warning about what happens when you win the lottery and forget how to work. This is the resource curse, the most seductive version of the wealth hack, and the one that has claimed more empires than any invading army. In the mid-16th century, Spain was the undisputed superpower of Europe. Their tercios were the most feared infantry on the continent, and their galleons dominated the Atlantic. But Spain's real power didn't come from its factories or its farms. It came from a single freezing mountain in the Andes called Potosi. This mountain was, quite literally, made of silver. For decades, a river of silver flowed from the New World into the Spanish treasury in Seville. To the Spanish kings, it felt like infinite money. They believed they had hacked the global economy. Why bother building a textile industry like the English? Why bother developing a merchant class like the Dutch? If Spain needed something ships, grain, luxury silks, or mercenary armies, they simply cut a check in silver. But here is the cold, hard math that the Spanish crown ignored. Wealth is not the metal you dig out of the ground. Wealth is the productivity of your people. By flooding their own economy with easy silver, the Spanish triggered a price revolution. Inflation skyrocketed. Because there was so much money chasing so few locally produced goods, the price of everything in Spain became twice as expensive as anywhere else in Europe. Spanish businessmen couldn't compete. It became cheaper for a Spaniard to buy a shirt from a French weaver or a tool from a German blacksmith than to make it at home. Slowly, the wealth hack turned into a suicide pact. Spain was the conduit, the funnel through which the wealth of the Americas flowed to build the industries of its rivals. The silver would arrive in Seville on a Monday, and by Tuesday, it was being shipped out to bankers in Genoa and manufacturers in Antwerp to pay off the crown's debts and import the basics of life. Spain had the appearance of a titan, but it had hollowed itself out. It was a nation of aristocrats and soldiers living on a credit card backed by a mountain that was slowly running dry. When the silver production finally began to slow, the Spanish Empire didn't just decline, it suffered a total systemic organ failure. They had mistaken a temporary windfall for a permanent status. They had used their hack to bypass the hard work of building a real economy, and in doing so, they ensured that when the silver was gone, there would be nothing left but the ghosts of a golden age and a ledger full of red ink. The most sophisticated version of the wealth hack, however, doesn't involve silver mines or desert canals. It involves the very paper in your wallet. To see the ultimate financial heist, we must look at the ruins of Europe in 1945. The history books tell us that Britain emerged from the Second World War as a noble victor, the lion that stood alone against the darkness. But if you were to walk into the Bank of England in 1945, you wouldn't see a victory parade. You would see a crime scene. Britain had spent every ounce of its gold and liquidated its global investments to fight Hitler. On paper, the empire was a hollow shell, owing billions to its own colonies, most notably India. During the war, Britain had taken food, raw materials, and soldiers from India on a massive scale. But they didn't pay for these resources with cash. Instead, they used a wealth hack known as the sterling balances. London told India, "We will take your grain and your steel now, and in exchange we will credit you with British pounds. But you cannot spend those pounds yet. They are locked in a bank account in London until the war is over." It was a forced loan, a global-scale IOU issued by a master to a servant. By the end of the war, Britain owed India the equivalent of trillions in today's money. But here is where the hack becomes a betrayal. When the war ended, India expected to use those trillions to industrialize and feed its people. Britain, however, had a different plan. They knew that if India suddenly withdrew all that money, the British pound would collapse and the UK economy would vanish overnight. So, the British did something unthinkable. They simply froze the accounts. They told the newly independent nations that their hard-earned money was unconvertible. They dictated how much India could withdraw and what they could buy, with it insisting that the money only be spent on British-made goods. This was the sterling trap. Britain had financed its survival and the birth of its modern welfare state by effectively stealing the savings of its poorest subjects. They used the debt they owed to their colonies as a leash to keep those colonies tethered to the British economy long after the flags were lowered. It is the dark irony of the 20th century. The liberation of the world from fascism was funded by a financial swindle of imperial proportions. The British didn't just win the war. They made the people they ruled pay for the privilege of being governed. This chapter proves the ultimate rule of the hack. If you control the currency and the banking system, you can steal more wealth with a fountain pen than an army can steal with 1,000 cannons. We have seen the wealth hack in many forms. We saw it as a mortgage in the Suez Canal, a lottery win in the silver mines of Spain, and a currency swindle in the streets of London. But the most important lesson of this story isn't about the past, it's about the pattern. History is not a straight line of progress. It is a series of credit cycles. Every few centuries, a power emerges that thinks it has solved the problem of scarcity. They find a way to spend money they haven't earned, to build a lifestyle they cannot sustain, and to project a power they do not truly possess. They believe they have hacked the system. But there is a fundamental law of the universe that no emperor, no central banker, and no prime minister can ever truly escape. The law of the ledger. You can delay the bill, you can hide the debt in complex financial instruments, and you can even force your neighbors to hold your devaluing paper. But eventually, the math catches up. When we look at the world today, we see the same shadows. We see nations with debt to GDP ratios that would have made the Ottoman sultans tremble. We see superpowers that rely on the easy silver of digital money printing to keep their aging infrastructure from crumbling. We see a global financial system that is more interconnected, more leveraged, and more fragile than it was in 1875 or 1945. The wealth hack works because it exploits the human desire for a shortcut. It promises the glory of the empire without the sacrifice of the citizen. It promises the Paris of the Nile without the taxes to pay for it. But as Egypt, Spain, and Britain learned, when you borrow your status, you are merely renting your sovereignty. The most surprising wealth hack in history is actually a warning. The moment you think you found a way to get something for nothing, you have already become the product. Sovereignty is not just about having a flag and a seat at the UN. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you do not own your debt owns you. As the ink dries on the latest global bailouts and the interest rates begin their inevitable climb, we are reminded that empires rarely die in a single dramatic explosion. They die when the check bounces. They die when the world realizes the giant has armor of steel but feet of clay. The Cold War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Imperial Age didn't end with a bang, they ended with a margin call. And in the ruthless game of history, the only way to win is to make sure you aren't the one holding the bill when the music stops. It's the Wealth History Tales channel, and this has been a breakdown of history's most surprising wealth hack. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve.